Most people assume that a loner suffers from a deficit, that he has less confidence, less social intelligence, less understanding of how human dynamics actually work. This is almost never true. The loner, more often than not, has studied people carefully. He has mapped their patterns, anticipated their reactions, understood their motivations from a distance with a precision that would surprise most of the people he has chosen not to approach. The problem is not that he does not know, the problem is that knowing became the activity itself. At some point, the mind stopped being a tool and became the territory. That shift happened gradually, and it made a certain kind of sense when it happened. The internal world offered something the external world had failed to deliver: predictability, control, zero cost of rejection. Inside his own thinking, every variable was manageable. Every conversation could be rehearsed. Every outcome could be anticipated before it became real. The mind built an architecture of safety, and that architecture was genuinely functional for a period. What nobody tells you, and what the loner rarely tells himself, is that adaptive strategies have expiration dates. What protected the system yesterday does not necessarily serve it today. It just continues running because it was never formally shut down. The longer a person operates almost exclusively in internal processing mode, the more the gap between what he can think and what he can actually do begins to widen. This is not a gap in intelligence. It is a gap in muscle. Social presence, like any physical capacity, atrophies through disuse. And because the mind is a system that above all protects its own coherence, it will generate increasingly convincing reasons to remain inside. The analysis grows more sophisticated. The justifications become more refined. What is really happening is that the cost of inaction is being distributed invisibly across years, while the cost of action feels immediate and concentrated in each single moment. That asymmetry is the mechanism, not weakness, not fear in the crude sense of the word. A precise calculation, one the nervous system performs thousands of times a day, that consistently returns the same answer. Stay in the simulation where outcomes can be controlled and avoid the field where they cannot. What happens when that calculation changes is not a story of courage or transformation in the motivational sense. It is a story of physics. When a person who has been living almost entirely inside his own head begins to insert himself into the actual world, even incrementally, even imperfectly, the environment responds to different inputs. It cannot do otherwise. The social ecosystem around any individual is not static. It is a system continuously calibrating its responses based on what that individual consistently signals. A person who signals absence, distance, and interiority for long enough trains his environment to expect exactly that. The moment those signals change, the system begins recalibrating. The first thing that collapses is the predictive model. And this collapse, which feels like disorientation, is actually information. The loner's internal map is detailed, but it was drawn without field data. It was constructed from observation at a distance, from inference, from projection. The moment real interaction begins replacing mental rehearsal, the map corrects itself rapidly. What seemed like an impenetrable social hierarchy reveals itself to be contextual and fluid. What appeared to be the immovable confidence of others turns out to be, in most cases, a trained behavior, not a fixed attribute. The walls that the mind had cataloged and accepted as permanent turn out to be, at least in part, walls it had built, and then forgotten it had built. This is what the shift actually is. Not the discovery that the world is warmer or kinder than expected, that framing is too soft and too imprecise. It is the discovery that the world is more responsive than the model had accounted for, that the rigidity was not in the environment, but in the lens, that the lens had been calibrated inside a controlled space and then applied uncorrected to a dynamic one. The discomfort that accompanies the first weeks of this recalibration is real and should be treated as such. It is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is the nervous system, running on outdated threat assessments, encountering evidence that contradicts its own predictions. Every interaction that ends without catastrophe is a data point. The system registers it even if the conscious mind is too busy cataloging what went awkwardly to notice. Over time, the dataset accumulates. The threat model begins updating. What the mind had filed under dangerous slowly migrates toward manageable. What it had filed under impossible gets reclassified as untested. That reclassification does not happen through reflection. It happens through repetition at low cost, a brief exchange with someone standing in line, a comment offered in a room where the stakes are minimal, a small act of presence in a situation that would previously have been navigated through withdrawal. These are not grand social experiments. They are calibration inputs. Their value is not in what they produce socially. Their value is in what they report back to the nervous system. That the external world does not collapse when you decide to exist visibly within it. The redistribution of energy that follows is not metaphorical. Ruminative processing, the kind that runs inside a closed loop, analyzing the same scenarios across years without new data, carries a real cognitive cost. It produces fatigue without output. It consumes the same resources that executive function, attention, and action require. When the loop is interrupted by actual experience, even briefly, the energy does not disappear. It redirects. The person who steps out of the simulation and into the field, even for minutes, experiences a shift in subjective time and mental clarity that feels disproportionate to what actually occurred. This is because the system finally has something to process that is new. There is a distinction here that matters and must not be collapsed. Leaving the interior life behind is not the goal. The analytical depth that the loner has developed over years of observation and internal processing is not a liability to be discarded. It is a precision instrument that has simply been aimed at the wrong target. Applied to the real field, to reading actual contexts, calibrating real interactions, adjusting approach based on live feedback rather than projected outcomes, that same depth accelerates learning at a rate that someone who has never developed it cannot match. The instrument was never the problem. The problem was using it as a substitute for the experience it was designed to interpret. Depth as an asset looks like bringing genuine attention to an actual conversation. Depth as avoidance looks like preparing for a conversation so thoroughly that the conversation never takes place. The person who has spent years constructing an elaborate internal life does not need to become someone else. He needs to stop using that interior architecture as a residence and start using it as a navigation system. The difference is fundamental. A residence is where you stay. A navigation system is what you use to move. At some point in this process, not immediately and not on any fixed schedule, but inevitably, something in the external environment responds in a way the model had not predicted. A connection forms where isolation had been expected. An opportunity surfaces in a context that had previously been dismissed. A person who had been cataloged as unreachable turns out to be entirely reachable under actual conditions. These moments are not rewards for effort. They are corrections delivered by the field to a model that had been running too long on its own assumptions. The shift is not about becoming more social, more open, or more emotionally available in any prescribed sense. It is about re-establishing contact between the precision of the analytical mind and the reality it was always meant to engage. Most people who operate predominantly inside their own heads are not afraid of the world. They are afraid of a version of the world that was accurate at some point in the past and has since remained frozen in